Our speaker this evening is our own Bob Scott, who, along with Julia, are the co-founders of Sarum Seminar, which, according to my rudimentary calculations, has been running for like 27 years now. I wish somebody would figure that out exactly for me, because I started like in the second year of this. And Bob's not only co-founder of Sarum Seminar, but he was formerly the associate director of the Center for Advanced Studies in the Behavioral Sciences, which is up on the Stanford campus, up in the beautiful foothills there, as some of you will remember also. His talk this evening is The Wonders of Stonehenge, the hows, the whens, and the whys of its construction. This reminds me of his wonderful book on the how, the when, and the whys of cathedral building. So now we get what even came before that. So Bob, if you're ready.
Before I start, this talk, I believe, breaks the record for staff support because so many people were involved in putting this thing together, starting with Bob Neiden, because Bob helped me take all the images that you're going to be looking at and put them in the right order so that you will be able to see them. And he is going to be running that part of the program from his home in Palo Alto. Meantime, Julia is sitting in the next room, and she is the host for this whole thing. And she has organized the logistics of this, which included an actual dress rehearsal with Bob and Julia and me, but then he drew Cindy into it because we had to make sure that what we were doing actually worked. And then, of course, there's Steve Broadbent, and he is up in Oregon, and he is recording this whole thing. And Evelyn is riding over the top of it. Now, all of this has put an immense amount of pressure on me. This better go well, is all I can say. Not the logistics of it, but I better have something interesting to say because there's so much tech support that went into it. The origin of the idea for the talk came from an announcement that was made of a special exhibit at the British Museum that began in February, and it was about Stonehenge. The image you're looking at was part of the catalog that was issued in connection with that exhibit. And what the exhibit was about, it was an attempt to bring together not only what had previously been known about Stonehenge, but to include especially all of the very recent archaeological research that has been done about Stonehenge and the greater Stonehenge area, and get it all under one roof, so to speak, which they did in the catalog, which is about a 272-page, densely footnoted document, which I've spent a lot of time looking at. And so the talk here is an attempt to kind of draw on what was previously known, add some of the new ideas, and then I want to add a whole lot of additional questions to invite you to think about them. Now, you must be asking yourself, what am I doing talking about Stonehenge in a seminar devoted to medieval history and culture? And I have two answers to that. One is Evelyn told me I could do it. So if you have questions about that, address them to her. But in a more serious vein, it turns out that when I started looking into Stonehenge, and especially some of the new research, there were some remarkable similarities between the Stonehenge and stone monuments of Britain generally, and Gothic cathedrals. And what I'll be doing is trying to point your attention to those as we go along. Now, also, please bear in mind that I'm trying to cover 1,000 years of history in 1 hour. So cut me some slack here if I skip over things very quickly. You know, I'm sure that Stonehenge, it's iconic, but at the same time, it is hardly the only Neolithic monument in Britain. One source in the catalog estimates the number of stone circles alone in the whole of Great Britain. And to my surprise, their estimate is that there are 1,000 of them. So Stonehenge is not alone by any means. And as I'm sure you also know, it is by no means the most elaborate. You'll remember, for those of you who went on cathedral trips with Julia and me, we often went to Avebury, and Avebury is by order of magnitude larger than Stonehenge ever was. It dates to 300 years prior to Stonehenge. It was at the time the largest stone circle in the whole of Europe. It was about, in diameter, about 4 football fields across. It had a 1.5 mile long processional way, at the base of which was Silbury Hill, which was the tallest human-made structure in the whole of Europe at the time. Another site which I've never actually been to but want to is in the county of Dorset, and it's a great curse. It's a processional way, again dating to about the same time as Avebury, and it's 6 miles long from end to end, running straight east to west. So it's a mammoth excavation. And Britain, of course, isn't the only place in Europe where you find Neolithic monuments. In the catalog, there's one source that estimates that there's something like 30,000 such monuments scattered all over Europe. Perhaps some of you have visited Karnak. That's one of the most spectacular. It's in Brittany, and it's got 3,000 standing stones. And since the catalog was published, of course, there is this astonishing discovery in Spain, in southern Spain at Huelva, of 526 previously overlooked standing stones and earthen monuments that were just discovered literally this year. So Stonehenge is not by any means alone or necessarily the largest, even though it is iconic. The other point that has emerged very clearly is that Stonehenge is not a local monument. It attracted people from all over Britain and the European continent, and it's been because of the excavations of graves that have taken place in the larger Stonehenge area that they've found grave gifts that were left, that were buried with the bodies, from places like the Orkney Islands, which is 700 miles to the north in Scotland, but also Switzerland, northern France, Brittany, and Germany. And what that's telling us is that Stonehenge was apparently very widely known and well known. It was the spot for migration and perhaps even a place of pilgrimage from the far north. So when we talk about Stonehenge, though it is iconic, it's merely one example of many, many thousands of other monuments. So now let me get to Stonehenge. And what I want to do is to begin by reminding you of the basic facts about it, which I suspect many of you will already be familiar with, but stick with me here. The monument that survives today evolved over a course of 7 more or less distinct building campaigns that spanned a period of just over 1,000 years, from 3100 BC to 2000 BC. And for purposes of discussion here, what I've done is to condense this into 3 building campaigns, which I'll call Stonehenge 1, Stonehenge 2, and Stonehenge 3. So let's look at Stonehenge 1. And it dates to 3100 BC. It consisted of a circular bank, which you can see depicted here in the diagram, with a ditch on the outside. And then within it, you have this circle of stones that were blue stones. And these are the stones that came from Wales. That's at a site I'll describe in some detail later on. It's about 145 miles from Stonehenge. And so that raises the question of how did they get there? But in addition to this inner ring of stones, it has another feature that really caught my attention, because you see that ring of a mound of stone, earth, and then on the outside is a ditch. Well, any of you who have ever walked around the landscape of Wiltshire in that area know that the topsoil is very, very shallow. And you don't have to go down very far, maybe a foot or two, before you hit a bed of chalk, which is very deep and dense bed of chalk. Well, the excavations that have been done of Stonehenge 1 show that the topsoil was scraped off that circle. It was mounded up, but then piled on top of it was the chalk, which was also used to line the ditch that was formed by that excavation. And what's interesting about that to me is that it means that when the sunlight was hitting that monument, it was being illuminated by the chalk. And as I want to try to explain, I believe they were playing with light there in the very same way the Gothic cathedrals were playing with light. And my reasons for saying that will become clear when we get to Stonehenge 3. Now, Stonehenge 2 was built about 200 to 500 years later. And to build it, they removed, I think, almost all, but if not all, many of the blue stones that you see depicted in that diagram of Stonehenge 1. It also had in the middle of it a wooden structure of some kind that long since rotted and decayed away, so there's no telling what that was actually about. But the stones were removed, and that left holes in the monument where the stones had been set. And these became places for burial pits for the cremated remains of Stonehenge people. And they're known ever since as Aubrey holes, and that's because the 17th century antiquarian John Aubrey uncovered them. He's the one who discovered them. Now, what those holes tell us, the analyses that have been done of the context, the content of those holes, tells us that at this point the monument became, if it wasn't before, a cemetery landscape. It was a cemetery. It was a place where cremated remains of people were being placed in the holes where those stones had been. And thus far, they have excavated 60 of the stones, which is about half of them. It's estimated that if they excavated all of them, you would find about 150 to 200 people buried there. And the chemical analyses done of the contents of those holes indicate that the charcoal that was used to produce the cremation actually came from the very same area in Wales where the bluestones came from, the Preseli Hills. And so it's another connection between Stonehenge and the Preseli Hills, and I'm going to be saying more about that in a moment. Then you get to Stonehenge 3. And the easiest way, here's a diagram of it. And the easiest way to describe is not to take you through the 5 separate buildings campaigns that went into it, but to start at the end. And that's what's depicted in this rather primitive diagram that I'm showing you. The first thing to note is this outer ring of sarsen stones. Sarsen stones are sandstone blocks, and I'll tell you where they came from in a minute. And they're really pretty large. Each one weighed about 25 tons. They were about 13 feet high, 7 feet wide, 2.6 feet in thickness. So they're very big. And as you can see, they're connected to one another by these lintels and mortise and tendon joints. And what I want you to notice here is that the lintels, those are the horizontal blocks, have holes in them which exactly fit into those knobs that you see in the standing upright stones. Bob, if we could have the next slide, there it is. That shows you actually what they're like, not diagrammatically, but actually as they presently exist. And you can see the upright stone has that knob at the top, and then the lintel has these 2 carved things which allowed it to be connected.
Wow.
Okay, so now if we could go back, Bob, to slide number 3. There it is. Nope, keep going. There. And so I've described this circle of sarsen stones, and then you see these smaller stones. Those are blue stones, which are used to encapsulate the trilithons, and there are blue stones within the trilithon complex itself. There are 5 trilithons. A trilithon is merely 2 parallel stones which are connected by a lintel at the very top. And so a lot of the blue stones that had been part of Stonehenge 1 made their way back into the monument and were used to basically frame these trilithons that sat at the very center. There are 5 of these trilithons. You can see 2 on each side of the largest one in the middle. And the point here I want to make is that this outer circle, let me get the exact dimensions of that. I think they were, just hang on. Oh, here it is. Okay. So the outer circle of sarsen stones with the lintels on top brought their height to 15 feet. Then these 4 lintels on either side of the main one brought the height to 18.6 feet. And then the largest one in the middle is 26 feet. So what you have is an arrangement of the smaller stones on the outside, followed by these 4 trilithons, which are 3 feet higher, followed by the massive one in the middle. Now, okay, and as I'm sure you know, the way it is oriented, you have, there you go, you have, this depicts the summer solstice, which is shining directly into the middle of this monument, and the winter solstice is over to the left, the summer solstice is to the right, and it's illuminating the interior of the monument. Now, there's a very interesting feature of those trilithons, and that is that they discovered that the inward-facing part of the trilithons had been treated with gypsum, which is a pearly kind of substance that would make it glow. And so when you have the sun coming into the middle of the monument, it's illuminating it. I think if we go to slide 7, Bob, there. Oh, this shows you. Sorry, this is the heel stone that's in front of you, and the sun is rising directly over the top of that and into the middle of the monument. And if you have the next slide, there it is. It shows you how it lights up the interior of this monument, of what remains of it. Now, it's because of this fact that they were treated deliberately with gypsum that leads me to believe that they were manipulating light in the way that I suggested they were in Stonehenge 1. It's another kind of interesting affinity that it's got with Gothic cathedrals where light is so central. Now, a final feature I want to mention are what are called 4 station stones. And I believe that I can't point them out here easily without a pointer, but what those station stones are doing is they're marking the beginning and the ending of the rising and setting of the moon in the course of its own celestial cycle. Now, I've done a lot of research looking into why was the moon of interest. We know the sun was, and no one has really ever come up with a very satisfactory account for why Stonehenge people even cared about the moon. But the fact is that they did. And what's interesting to me is how they ended up positioning those so that they accurately depicted the rising and the setting of the moon on the horizon. It turns out that that the rising and setting of the moon, if you look at it from the center of the monument, follows a trajectory that goes across the horizon from the southeast to the northeast and back again. And to make that cycle, southeast to northeast and then back, takes 18.6 years to track it. And so what the post holes were doing was marking it year by year by year, tracking that. But what to me is so remarkable is that there wasn't just one row of post holes, there were 6. And what that suggests is that before they put those station stones in place, they had been tracking the moon for a period of 112 years before they were actually able to do it. And that becomes really critical in terms of the obsessive precision that was discovered in this monument as it was when it was finally built. Then it had 1 or 2 other features. One of them is the Stonehenge Avenue, and that's depicted on the slide that's about to appear. You there, Bob? Oh, there. Oh, yeah, yes, there you go. The green line, you see, it says Stonehenge, and there's a straight line out, and then it deviates off to the right and down to the River Avon. It was built, the best estimate was that it was built after Stonehenge 3 was completed. It itself is a major excavation that also has this feature of embankments. There's a photograph of it, and you can see it faintly outlined just over the heel stone. But it was a major excavation. It was about, I think, 300 meters directly across from the monument before it deviates off to the right, and it involved the estimates are a pretty huge amount of work to dig it out and it goes, as I say, all the way down to the river Avon. And finally, there is, of course, the heel stone, and there's a picture of the heel stone with the sun rising on the day of the summer solstice, dead over the top of it and into the middle of the monument. Now, the Stonehenge monument sits in the middle of the densest concentration of Neolithic and Bronze Age monuments anywhere in Britain. And here's a diagram of at least the ones that were known at the time that this diagram was drawn. And you see the Great Cursus, which preceded Stonehenge. That's about 1.5 miles or 2 mile long processional way. A lesser Cursus is up on the left-hand corner. Durrington Walls was a kind of settlement, which at the time had something like 1,000 houses and structures and buildings in it, presumably housing a lot of the people who worked on Stonehenge. And then there are all these henges nearby, including Normanton Downs. And here I wanted to show you this because this is why this whole area is called a cemetery landscape, because you can see all of these burial mounds that are populated all over the place. And it's estimated now that there's something in the order of 1,000 of these burial mounds in the immediate surround of Salisbury. And this is why it's called a cemetery landscape.
Obliterated over time too.
Yeah.
Okay. Now let me return and say a few words about the stones themselves. I said there are two types of stones that are in the monument: the sarsen stones that made up the trilithons and the ring of outer stones that are part of the Stonehenge 3. And then there are the blue stones, which are built into that monument and kind of surround the trilithons in the middle. Neither of those stones is indigenous to the Stonehenge area. And a great deal of work has now been done trying to figure out where they came from. And also, of course, trying to understand how they ever transported them to the site. And here in brief is what they seem to know about. First, the blue stones. Each one is about 6.6 feet in height, and it weighs 25 tons or something of that order. And it's estimated that at one time or the other, there were as many as 80 of those blue stones in this monument. And it's now been established where they came from. And they came from an outcropping of stones located in the Priscilla Hills. And there's a photograph of the outcropping from which they came.
Wow.
They know that this is where they came from because they have used X-ray spectrometry and laser technology to precisely identify the exact spot where the stones came from. So it's a way of kind of, as it were, tracking the DNA of the stones and pinpointing the exact site. Now you can see that from the outcropping, quarrying that would never have been a simple matter, but it's a lot easier if the stones are basically upright and can be carved away from their setting. Now, until very recently, it was always thought that the way those stones got to Stonehenge is that people at Stonehenge somehow, nobody knew how, knew about the Priscilla Hills of Wales, and they migrated there and took work crews and carved those stones and lugged them back on a route that I'll show you in just a minute. And so that gives rise to all kinds of speculation about, did they float them across the Bristol Channel? Did they take them overland? If they took them overland, how did they transport them at a time when you didn't have wheels and things like that? And so there's a whole lot of literature, and I remember reading about this when I was writing the cathedral book, speculating about how all that happened and different. There were even experiments done where archaeologists would take stones and try to quarry them there and move them to the Bristol Channel and float them out and see if they could replicate what might have happened. Well, now the most recent research has totally upended that whole scenario. It's been done by an archaeologist at the University of London, whose name is Mike Parker Pearson. And he excavated the site of a pre-existing stone circle in the Priscilla Hills that's immediately adjacent to the quarry that you're looking at. It's called Wan Mon. Wan Mon is the Welsh word for peat moor. And it dates to 3,300 BC. And it turns out that the stones in that monument bear a remarkable resemblance in layout and structure and form to the stones that were part of the blue stones that formed Stonehenge 1. And what he has been able to show is that Wan Mon was under construction, doesn't know for how long, but it was going to be a large circle exactly like Stonehenge 1 was planned to be. And it was work halfway through was interrupted. And they know that because they found the holes that had been dug, but no stones had ever been laid in them. And what he is hypothesizing is that they stopped work and that the stones to Stonehenge, the blue stones, got there by a migration of people from Wales who basically took their stone circle with them. And he cites quite a bit of evidence to support this, but it's still speculative, it's still a hypothesis, and he is still hard at work doing additional excavations in that area to see if he can confirm that suspicion. Well, then the story changes if he's right, because now the question is, how did tribal peoples in Wales even know about Stonehenge? What is it that led them to abandon the site that they were working on and take their stones and move it to Stonehenge and then insinuate it into what was then in existence at Stonehenge at the time? Now here's the hypothesized route. Nobody knows for sure, but that's the one that is most commonly cited. It's over hill and over dale, and how you could be moving stones of that size, that distance remains a mystery. About the blue stones, one more thing to mention, and that is that once they got there, they had been moved in and out of that monument multiple times. For example, when they redesigned, when they went from Stonehenge 1 to Stonehenge 2, they removed a lot of the blue stones, and that's what created these Aubrey holes that I mentioned. They then wanted to re-insinuate them into Stonehenge 3, but they couldn't do that until they got the trilithons built in the middle and then moved them in. So there's a lot of backing and forthing. And in fact, sadly, a lot of those blue stones are missing. And the reason they're missing is because locals of later generation cannibalized them in order to build houses, farming structures, and so on. And exactly the same thing happened at Avebury. So a lot of the blue stones are scattered around in buildings in the greater kind of Wiltshire area. Okay, so now the sarsen stones. There's a study that was published in 2020 by a geologist named David Mash from the University of Brighton. And he shows very conclusively that 50 of the 52 sarsen stones at Stonehenge are direct chemical matches to those found at this site that you're looking at here, Westwoods. It's located 20 miles due north, not far from the Neolithic monument of Avebury, which I described earlier. Now, the thing about this that's puzzling is you can see that the stones that remain there are lying on the ground. And it was not an outcropping like you had in the Priscilla Hills. They were lying flat, and they were much larger than the bluestones. And that then raises the question of how in the world they ever pried them off out of the landscape. How did they load them up? How did they transport them? Which route did they follow? And all the rest. The most common theory is that tracks of logs were built along which the stones were dragged, but no one has ever found any clear evidence of that. And here are some diagrams which suggest what the right route might have been. The one on the left is a land route. The one on the right would have made it possible to do some of it by floating it on rivers to get it to the site of Stonehenge. Now, but once they dragged them there, they were not in the form that you see in the monument today. They looked more like this. These are sarsen stones of the type that were taken to Stonehenge. And that's what they looked like when they were dragged there. So they had to be sculpted. And they have found dressing pits, which are to the immediate east. Here's an example of one where they dragged the stones to those pits, and they dressed them so that they could be shaped and sculpted and smoothed, including building the lintels that had to be precisely hollowed out to shame them. And there again is that diagram that shows you the tongue and groove carvings that had to be done, as well as those mortise and tenon joints. And this diagram with the arrows on it shows you the mortise and tendons that are on the monument as it exists today. Now, once those stones were in place, they were absolutely mammoth. And here's a photograph that we found of a gentleman standing next to the largest of the great trilithons. And you can see, oh, there are two people in that figure, and you can see that they are dwarfed by this mammoth thing. And you look at it and you are puzzled to understand exactly how they might have been mounted. How did they get the lintels on top of those and fitted into the joints at the very top and all the rest? I mentioned that the inner facing was treated with gypsum that made them glow, and they were carved in such a way that they were slightly wider toward the top in order to make it appear that their perspective remains constant when viewed from the ground. And exactly how all of that was done has never been explained, because the problem is that in the excavations, they have not found evidence of the kind of tools that might have been used in order to do that kind of carving on stones of that magnitude. I should also point out that what you're looking at, that's the Great Trilithon, and that's 28 feet tall, I believe, with the lintel on top, but it goes down maybe 4 to 5 feet into the pit in which it rests. So these things were absolutely mammoth pieces of rock. Now, keep in mind that what I'm trying to describe here is how a single piece of stone was put in place. But bear in mind that the monument consisted of 30 huge sarsen stones from the westwood to create the outer circle, plus 10 giant stones for the inner trilithons, plus 35 lintels. So you're talking about moving 75 large stones in the final version of the monument. Now, so that's the story of the monument. Now the question is, what are we to make of it? And that monument, in my opinion, simply compels you to wonder about it. You're almost compelled to interrogate it in a quest to find some way to understand it. Leaving aside for the moment the myriad unanswered questions about the stones that I've already identified, the monument also invites questions of a different sort that, alas, I think can only be answered speculatively. The questions about the stones are what I think of as how questions. But the monument invites us to ask questions of a different sort, the what and the why of it. Why did they want to build it in the first place? What motivated Stonehenge people to undertake this monumental project in the first place? What drove them to stay with it for hundreds of generations? What kind of a cultural object exactly was it? What sort of work was it doing culturally for them and for their community? What purpose or purposes did it serve? Now, when you ask questions about the stone, at least you have something to look at. You can touch them, you can weigh them, you can measure them, you can figure out where they came from. You can experiment with speculatively about how they were transported and all the rest. But these other questions that I'm asking, the what and the why questions, you can't do that. At best, all you can do is speculate, and I'm going to do that. But bear in mind that they'd never filed an environmental impact report with the authorities in the greater Wiltshire area. So there's no written documentation of any kind that we can draw on to try to answer these questions. But I'm going to try. And if after I do that and you want to discuss it, I'm happy to do that. If you ask me what my evidence is, I'm going to send you to bed without supper because it's entirely speculative, but we'll see what you think of it. So when I began to think about these why and what questions, I found it useful to begin by reminding myself of the key features of the monument, the features that, to my mind, you would need to try to understand if you were to gain a grip on what it is actually about. And four things in particular immediately came to my mind. The first is that it is a monumental structure, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment. Secondly, that it is clearly a cemetery landscape with bodies buried, cremated bodies buried inside of it, but then all these burial mounds surrounding the adjacent landscape. Third, that it is clearly designed to track the movements of the sun, and in particular, to mark the exact day and time of the summer solstice. And the fourth feature, which I have become more and more interested in, is it took a very, very long time to do. Now, let me say a few words about what I mean when I say, when I talk about monumentality. Actually, all I mean by it is that when I think about a monument, a structure of any kind that is monumental, what I mean is that it attracts and demands our attention in ways that ordinary objects don't do. Sometimes it evokes awe, it evokes wonder, it can evoke a feeling of being utterly overwhelmed. It creates the impression that it is somehow the product of an effort that exceeds the capacity of ordinary mortals to ever achieve it. It's a thing that seemingly defies gravity. It denotes those who look at it, perhaps it dominates them. It may even intimidate them. It evokes disbelief that ordinary human beings could possibly have built it. It has this appearance of being the product of some superhuman effort. In short, what it does, it invites the viewer to ask the very same question I know so many of you asked yourselves while you were touring the great Gothic cathedrals of Europe together. How in the world did ordinary people do this? Now, these reactions indicate to me that whatever else it or other works of monumental architecture are about, they are aimed at drawing and holding our attention in a very, very dramatic way. They are meant to influence us in profound ways, causing us to respond in the ways that I have just described. Some people talk about monumental building as being all about social power, and they certainly are. But I prefer to think of them as being designed to attract in an almost gravitational like way our attention, and to hold it and to cause us to wonder about it. And that leads me to then wonder what, on whose behalf, or on behalf of what, is that intention being exercised? Now, to try to answer this or give a clue to where the answer might lie, I want to consider other types of monumental buildings for just a moment to contrast them with Stonehenge. Saddam Hussein, Franco, all of them were obsessed with building large-scale monuments. And what they all had in common is that they were all built very quickly. In most cases, during the lifetime of the political leader who inspired them with with statues of the leaders or of the movements on which they were erected. So you find statues of Mao and Lenin and Marx and Stalin and Hussein, along with symbols of their movements like swastikas and swords and sides and the like. So all of those monuments were built at the behest of and on behalf of political leaders who were deploying architecture as a weapon of power to control people, to intimidate them, frighten them, make it unmistakably clear who was in charge, to coerce them in ways that allowed the dictator to rule. Now consider Stonehenge. It's a different sort of monument. It's clearly monumental in my view, but it stands in contrast to the examples I've just given. For one thing, it wasn't built in a single lifetime. It was built over the course of centuries. Secondly, it is devoid of symbols or markings on the stones or anywhere near the monument that single out particular tribal leaders or even classes of leaders. This suggests to me that Stonehenge was not built on behalf of any one tribal leader or even class. It feels to me like something that was built rather on behalf of the community as a whole. So my point here is that if you contrast, let's say if you've been up to the De Young Museum, there's a great exhibit right now on the tombs and the statuary and so on of Ramses the Great, and they're all about Ramses. They were built for him. His image is all over the place. His name is carved into the monument. It was a structure that was built on his behalf, and it was built in a single lifetime. Stonehenge is different. It's a structure built on behalf of, I believe, an entire community, and it involved a collective effort of interminable length. Now, if there's anything to what I'm saying, that's my view of it. Then it leads me to wonder why it took the form it did. Why is it built on behalf of the collective? If it was built on behalf of the collective as a whole, did it take the form of a cemetery landscape? And why a structure to monitor the movements of the sun in such a precise way? It leads me to wonder what collective purposes, what collective ends were served by honoring the dead and the sun in this way, and why were these two features intimately interrelated and built into a single monument? I've explained to you that Stonehenge abounds with burial sites, and that in addition to the Aubrey holes, which are inside the monument, there's something like an estimated 1,000 additional burial mounds, long barrows, stone markers, and other places of burial. So it was clearly has this aspect of a cemetery to it. Now, what does that tell me about the Stonehenge people? Well, I believe it tells us that they held the dead in special regard. It's as if they felt a strong cultural need and obligation to remember the dead, to honor the dead, and to do so in ways that went beyond mere traditional graveyards. They required that the dead should be honored in ways that were truly monumental, that demanded grandeur, that required monuments designed to amaze and impress, and to be made of materials that would last forever. At the same time, it's a monument that's also reflects an obsession with tracking the movements of the sun over the course of each year, and to display the results of that tracking in a way that made the sun's movements orderly, predictable, and visibly apparent and evident to every member of the community. And now what I want to speculate about or suggest is that these two things might be intimately interrelated to one another. And what do I have in mind when I say that? Well, first, regarding the dead. Given the great lengths to which Stonehenge people obviously went in honoring the dead, it suggests to me that for Stonehenge people, the dead occupied a special place in the world of the living. It's almost as if the dead retained a vibrant presence in their lives. Now, clearly they did not behave as if they thought that when someone died, they just disappeared. Instead, they retained this kind of palpable presence in the lives of the living. It's as if they remained valued members of the community who needed to be remembered, honored, revered, even worshiped, perhaps, on the part of the living. And in addition, they, or perhaps because of this, they were imbued with a capacity to affect the world of the living in ways that were very, very consequential. They served as a resource available to the living to draw on as they struggled to cope with the precarious exigencies of daily life. Now, Stonehenge people are obviously not the first people who have regarded or still regard the dead in this way, because anthropological and historical studies of other societies, other periods in human history abound with examples of cultures that view the dead as a continuing presence in the lives of the living. And such studies describe societies that not only honor their dead, but treat them as akin to having an everyday presence in the lives of the living, where they're remembered, they're revered, they're worshiped, they're honored, they're spoken to, they're even consulted in imaginary conversations about life events, including clues to the nature of life in the hereafter. Why do people do that? Well, there are all sorts of reasons. Sometimes as an end in itself, sometimes they feel they should be something they should do, or that they're expected to do, or perhaps even as a way of reassuring themselves that they will not be forgotten when they themselves die. But that practice of expressing reverence for the dead in the form of providing honored monuments dedicated to them implies an additional consideration. It is the belief that even though persons have died, they retain the ability to impact the world of the living in important ways. They are, another way to put this, they are believed to have agency in the world of the living, able to influence events in ways that are highly relevant to the conditions of existence among the living. So in that worldview, the dead are thought to have the ability to intercede in the lives of the living in ways that can either be to the benefit or to the detriment of the living. Which it is depends crucially on whether those who have passed on feel that they are being appropriately honored by the living. And this, I believe, is one of the considerations that underlies the motivation to erect monuments to them, and what I mean when I say that in such cosmologies, the dead retain powerful agency in the world of the living. And incidentally, in case this has escaped your attention, this is precisely the thinking that went into the medieval cult of saints. It's exactly the same way of thinking about the role that the dead can play in intervening in the lives of the living. Well, if any of that makes sense, I don't know if it makes sense to you or not, but if for a moment let's play that it does, then it follows that a key indicator of the important role ascribed to the dead in affecting the world of the living will be reflected in the grandeur of the monuments erected to honor them. It provides insight into why so much effort and so many resources were devoted to creating honored places for them, and why venerating the dead can become such a vital and important cultural project. So the next question we need to think about is what the living most desire to gain by remaining, as it were, in the good graces of the dead. Well, no doubt many things: good health, prosperity, freedom from violence, the list goes on. But one consideration undoubtedly trumped all the others. It is the fact that these communities' survival depended entirely on agriculture. Agriculture, we know, is a very precarious and unpredictable enterprise. And these are pictures that were taken of huts that are at the new visitor center at Stonehenge, which are depicting what dwellings and agriculture were like during the Neolithic period. And from everything we know about farming during the Neolithic period, when it was first being introduced, people were literally and completely at the mercy of elements over which they had no effective control. If there was too little sunshine, crops wouldn't grow. Too little rain, and crops would wither on the vine. Too much rain, and they would rot. Excessive heat would cause them to wither. If you had an abundant harvest one year, it was no predictor of what you were going to get the next year. And crops and animals needed to be protected from predators and so on. And none of these things were in the control of people. Instead, their fate depended on the actions of celestial bodies, and in this, the sun was absolutely primary. Stonehenge people were in effect at the mercy of the sun. Its annual cycle was literally a life or death matter, and their survival depended on it. And this gave rise to an urgent need to basically track and document the movements of the sun in order to gain assurance that it was orderly, predictable, and recurrent. And that's what the monument was doing, in effect, what the Stone Circle Monument was doing. Now, if that's so, then these monuments are much more than mere mathematical exercises. They're actually efforts to provide reassurance to people that the sun is a predictable, reliable, and recurrent source of nourishment that contributes to the survival of the community itself. And the survival of the community itself depended essentially on having that reassurance that the sun had that predictability to it. So how do honoring the dead, then how does that factor into it? Well, there are a lot of different ways one can think of. One is, if you want to send a message to the dead of how honored they were, what you would want to do is basically build a monument that's organized around a cemetery that gives them a place of honor in that kind of cosmos. It's kind of akin to the way in which in Gothic cathedrals, people want to be buried as close to the high altar as they can get, because that's the most sacred part of the building, and it's a place of honor. And the same thing would be true here. But in addition, the dead were denizens of the celestial order where the sun is central. And in this respect, they're uniquely positioned to provide clues to the living about the patterning of the sun's movements. They are a source of information about life in the hereafter. They can advocate, perhaps, on behalf of whatever deities were associated with the sun in order to make sure that it remained a reliable and predictable and orderly source of life on Earth. And if that's true, then I think it begins to make a lot of sense about why this monument would have built into it both an instrument for tracking the movement of the sun and demonstrating its predictability through the monitoring of the summer solstice, and a cemetery landscape where the dead play an important role. Now, then there are a couple of other, and I'll be very interested to hear whether you think there's anything to this or not. But let me just make another couple of observations. Until very recently, people were aware that there were all these stone monuments all over the landscape of Britain, all over the landscape of continental Europe. But it was always thought that these were disconnected, unconnected to one another, built in different periods of time, and so on. But now what's emerged from the most recent archaeological research is that actually the period when they were built was fairly limited, just a matter of at most perhaps 2 centuries. And that many of these monuments were begun all at the same time. There's an archaeologist with the British English heritage. Her name is Susan Greene, and she summarized what this research tells us about this discovery. And she writes, "Stone circle monuments building was like a mania that drove them to build bigger and bigger, more and more, better and more complex." And that strikes me as remarkably similar to the phenomenon we see with Gothic cathedral buildings. And it helps us to understand what might have been motivating this different communities to build these monuments in order to have one of their own to ensure that the sun would be protective of them. Okay, now this leads me to 2 final points, and then I will be quiet. During the time that Julie and I were leading tours of English Gothic cathedrals, many of you joined those, and we always stayed at Sarum College. There's our favorite cathedral right there. And Stonehenge was right nearby, so we often took our groups out there. And the most common response to both of those monuments was identical. How in the world did they do this? How did Neolithic peoples, or those living during medieval times, manage to somehow assemble the materials, the human power, the communal will to execute projects like the cathedral or the stone circle? And both sites leave observers speechless and in awe. And this is exactly what I have in mind when I say that the monuments, for the purposes I have specified, in the case of Stonehenge, the sun on which life itself depended, in the case of the cathedrals on the divine, they need to be monumental. It isn't enough to build them out of shabby materials that won't last. It requires materials that are going to last forever, and they have to be monumental, defying belief in order to do the cultural work that they are created to do. Now, I think that the final point I want to make is, of course, having said all that, the monument, Stonehenge, remains maddeningly inscrutable. It was built by a vanished people. They left no written language, no blueprints, no tales, no legends, but instead just a bunch of stones and pot shards and flint and antlers and the like, leaving us to wonder how they did it. But the one thing that is really clear to me is that the project that I have just described required skills to complete it that defy my previous knowledge of Neolithic period, because the knowledge of astronomy and physics was incredibly sophisticated. It tells me that Stonehenge people had to have a very sophisticated, though intuitive grasp of the physics of motion, of force, of leverage, of lifting, of fulcrum, that allowed them to lift the stones in place. And for that reason, it's caused me to realize that these were not primitive societies, but very advanced civilizations that we're talking about. With that, I'd be very interested to hear what you think. Anyone?
So do we have questions? Yes.
Yes.
Michael Murphy?
There, I'm unmuting myself. Should I camera myself?
Sure.
Sure.
There you go.
Okay. Here I am. So the question that came up for me as you were talking, this is not an answer to your question, but sort of posing another question. One of the treatises I read, a fictionalized treatise, speculated a long period of...
So we see everybody.
Hi there, Grindleys. Let me keep talking and not have you guys, well, you can mute yourself until you're ready to talk. So what I was reading had this sort of fictionalized narrative where the people of the sun were arguing with the people of the moon, not unlike the Protestants and the Catholics in that period of back and forth on the European continent.
Yeah.
And that what we're seeing at Stonehenge is evidence of successive periods of the moon people dominated at this time and they built these things, and then the sun people dominated at that time. What do you think about that whole notion? Is there any evidence to support any of that?
Yeah, well, evidence, please don't use that word.
Okay.
Or you'll be sent to your room. But I had not heard that. But there's no question that at some point in its history, the moon played a very important role in that monument, but no one has ever, at least in the catalog that I read, come up with an explanation of why. So I'm happy to consider that and try to begin to think about where you would look for any evidence that might corroborate that view. But it's a very interesting thought, because it wasn't just Stonehenge that monitored the moon, it was other stone circles as well.
Right.
Good, thank you. Yeah.
Charlotte has a question. And you can unmute yourself, Charlotte.
Bob,
Right.
when you gave this
Yeah.
talk before, you mentioned that were found at Stonehenge the remains of people from far away, like from the continent.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I didn't hear you mention that tonight, but I found that absolutely fascinating and wondering what, if other people knew about that who are here today, and if you have any further explanation or discussion on that point.
Yeah, thank you. That is a fairly recent finding, which came from excavations of a grave where a famous archer from Switzerland his body was uncovered, and they know that because of DNA samples, but also the weaponry that he was buried with. But now the pottery that they're finding, I didn't get into that at all. I just didn't have time.
Right.
It's coming from all over Western Europe. And that is, of course, giving rise to the thought that what you're really talking about here is perhaps a destination for pilgrimage, a destination for migration, and the like. But it certainly contradicts the earlier idea that this was largely a local monument built only and exclusively by Stonehenge people for their own use. It was much more than that.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
And
Sure.
William, you're up next.
Thanks, Bob, very much. Well done. Perchance last night I stumbled on a Secrets of the Dead and a excavation at the TV program,
Yeah.
and the excavation of a archaeological site at the home of the brother of Princess Diana.
Ooh.
And they were looking for what his grandfather had told him about a 18th century village. And they had this site, and they did all sorts of really up-to-date, tech edge stuff. And they found some, obviously good archaeological non-evidence, but indications, and they began excavating. And they didn't find the village. What they found was a huge Neolithic, probably Neolithic roundhouse. And so you never know when you go digging what that is.
Yeah.
And that's simply by way of comment. And I would recommend anyone who has the chance to see it. I reflected that between Stonehenge and Cairo, there's 2,000 plus or minus miles, and the timing even of the Great Pyramid of Cheops is not that far off.
Correct.
100 years.
Yeah.
So I look at Stonehenge versus the Middle Kingdom as one guy's had technology and centralized power.
Mhm.
And they had centralized power, able to either bribe or enforce thousands of people to work for the benefit of the community. All right. And if you, and I only underscore that point, it was also in worship of the dead and worship of themselves. But I underscore that because on a trip 20 plus years ago along the Nile, I kept noticing these very tall, I would say 5 to 8 meter tall monoliths. And I asked a very well-educated guide, and he said, oh yes, those were the monoliths which marked the property boundaries of the ancient Egyptians. So they knew that when the Nile flooded, where their property was, because otherwise it gets covered with silt.
Yeah.
So to me, 2,000 miles isn't all that far if you're starting to find these burial sites in Europe.
Yeah.
So maybe there's some translation of technology there. Speculation, 110%.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. That's very interesting. Yeah.
Virginia? Oh, sorry, Bob, you want to say more?
No, I don't.
Virginia has a question. Unmute. Virginia, yeah.
Okay, there we go. It's
Yeah.
good I'm following William because I have the same thought about Egypt. I think the Pyramid of Cheops, this is, I used to lecture on this, but that was about 30 years ago. I think it was about 2600. And the
That's right.
Old Kingdom began in about 3000, and it didn't come from nowhere. So The dates are very similar to Stonehenge 1, and then of course the New Kingdom would be coming along. Well, it would be after, I guess, Stonehenge 3. So I do think there's the potential ties there, and I agree that I wouldn't see the distance as a problem. I mean, we know the Vikings, for example, got down to Istanbul and so on. So even though it's much later, but the technology of getting places was not so different, or not different at all, really. And both the Egyptian communities and Stonehenge depended on architecture. And the pharaoh, of course, was the sun god, and or at certain points was considered to be tied with the sun god Re. And of course, the pharaoh in his boat, went to the west and disappeared, and then rose again in the east to mark that track. And also in that, God, who was that original book, Stonehenge Decoded? You'll know the author.
Yeah.
Can you mention the author? It escapes me at the moment.
Yeah, me too. But I know
okay.
but
That was sort of the latest when I was lecturing, but he was talking about it being a calendar, and I don't think that contradicts what you said, but I think that's an important item to consider in working out when to plant crops and what's happening when and so on. And as far as the moon goes, I know I read something about it, but I can't remember anymore what it was, but it was connected. There was some kind of lunar course, was like the 18.6 years or 19 years, and that connected with the Aubrey holes, but I'm sorry, I can't remember what that was about at this point.
Okay. I hadn't heard any connection between the cycles of the moon and the Aubrey holes, but I'll look in the catalog again.
Well, it might not be there, I don't know, but I'm trying to remember whether that was in Stonehenge Decoded. I think it could have been.
Yeah.
Anyway. Yes.
I have a question.
Yeah.
We were at Stonehenge one summer at the summer equinox, and there were thousands and thousands of people there.
Yeah.
People, what were they doing?
Yeah. Well, the Druids started that. As far as I know, they claimed that it was their ancestral home.
And when were the Druids, tell us?
Well, the Druids who first appeared didn't appear until 1905. So, and then they kind of made up this whole story about there were ancient Druids who were affiliated with Stonehenge, and the modern day Druids were kind of rediscovering that connection. The archaeologists whose works I have read think that's a lot of hooey, but it became a kind of attraction for what were known in the area as festival people.
We call them hippies.
Yeah, hippies. And they would show up attempting to basically lay claim to the monument at the time of the summer solstice. And Julie and I remember well, we were there one summer, and there were police vans all over the area, and anybody driving a VW bus got pulled over and sent home because they were certain that they were trying to head to the monument. And the crowds became very, very unruly. And the way they finally solved it was basically to say to people, okay, you're welcome. They opened up the monument, and you say anybody who wants to come there can come there at the time of the summer solstice. And this whole movement lost interest the minute that it became openly available and no longer confrontational. But that's as much as I know about it, Larry.
John Wilkes, hi.
Hi, apologies, I missed the very first few minutes of this, but I just want to re-echo something I think both you and Virginia said, which is I went to the Stonehenge exhibit at the British Museum.
Oh, yeah.
few months ago, and they were emphasizing just how much interchange there was between different communities across Europe.
Yeah.
Things.
Yeah.
But the thing I was wondering about was the combination of two observations you made. One is that they now think that all this building happened in a relatively short period of time, together with the fact that we needed a couple of 100 years worth of data in order to be able, or experience to be able to put together the moon placement.
Yeah.
Do you have any ideas on how they might keep the information or build up the information, record it, that would be necessary to be able to put things in the right place when they were done?
Yeah.
The thought that I was wondering about was, you said the surfaces of the stones were covered with gypsum, at least some of them.
Yeah.
My understanding is by this stage they already had patterns on potteries, but correct me if I'm wrong.
Oh, they did, yeah, but not on the stones themselves. But they
How
did.
do you know?
Oh.
Right, we know that there was traces of
Room,
gypsum
John.
on the faces, but we don't know whether there were patterns on the faces
Yeah,
of the
you
gypsum.
don't know that. No, that's right. That's right. But John, I want to. I gave this talk here at the Sequoias, where Julie and I live, and somebody afterwards said they were very interested in that tracking of the moon. How did they track the solstice? How did they determine the exact location? And I started looking into that, and it's mind-bogglingly complicated. It's not like, you can take 1 year's worth of data and say, okay, that's it. You can't do that.
That's what I was wondering about. How do we?
Yeah, exactly. And I'm still looking for any kind of article or documentation of the technique that would have to be used, and how many cycles would it take before you were absolutely certain that you had it right. You can put a rod in the ground and it casts a shadow and it's a certain angle. Well, yeah, except that's rather imperfect. And it's prone to error. And you need to have multiple years of observation before you can possibly do it. Yeah.
William has another question. Sorry,
Yeah.
I put your hand down, William.
Actually, it's the question this time. Do you know if these Aubrey holes referring to the same Lord Aubrey, the 18th century Lord, who actually wrote a very important book about Ferdinand Magellan's voyage?
Got me there. I don't know. He's described as an antiquarian, whatever that means.
Okay.
But he was the
Bob
one.
Nyden may know. He put his hand right up.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know whether it's the same Aubrey or not, but I think John Aubrey was pretty well known at the time. But my point actually is to the previous question. I think it's oral tradition is how they kept track. We don't give enough credit to the oral traditions. People memorized entire books worth of things and could repeat them on and on and on. People still, I mean, there are people who memorize entire books of the Bible or of the Koran or whatever. And if you memorize, this happens on the 4th day of the 5th month of the whatever, next time around, the following people know it. And it's not just one person, probably. There's probably several people that all memorize these same things and keep track and count them. So I don't know. That's my guess.
Wow.
Sounds plausible. Yeah.
Linda Papanicolaou?
Well, I was going to, in reference to what Bob has said, when you were talking about community, little alarm bells started going off in my mind because of kind of these utopian myths that go around about earlier ages being more or less a cycle of human societies that are more or less equal in villages. And it would seem to me that large complex programs like this, particularly requiring tracking of solar and lunar cycles over many, many years, yes, oral tradition, but it presumes a class stratified society with particular people who were charged with doing that.
Mhm.
But the other thing is, you know, what I was, as people were doing, well, how did they remember all this? Out of the blue, what popped into my mind was Sioux winter counts. Anybody know what a winter count is?
No.
The Sioux Indians had them, and they would paint on buffalo hides. And you would start in the middle, and the elders each year would pick out one thing that year that the year was known for. And you would track them, and the winter counts that survive are fairly recent, but it's in ancient form. So the winter count comes outward as in a spiral. And astronomical events could be one of the things that were recorded. If there was a particular thing that happened that year which was memorable, that's going to be, say, the year of the big eclipse or something like that. And at that age, I'm guessing anything painting, you know, if painting or any patterns in the gypsum doesn't survive, painting on a hide is certainly not going to survive.
Yeah.
So there is probably a lot of pictorial art that we don't know about, but a winter count system of recording would do it very handily.
Yeah. Yeah.
More questions or thoughts?
I'm out of ideas.
Thank you, folks. Evelyn, are you with us? Do you want to say a word or two?
Yeah, yes, I'm still here. Before I say thank you very much, could you give the name of this book or catalog again that you were working from?
Just keep talking. I'm going to get it and I'll show it to you. It's on my bookshelf. Just hang on.
Okay. All right. The date of our November meeting is the 14th. I'll keep that in mind with Asa Mittman. What we need is a whole bibliography of books about Stonehenge.
You know, I can put one together and I'll send it. Bob, do we have that slide? Can't remember.
Yeah, we do. If you want me to share it, I can put it up.
Yeah, put it up there.
Okay, let's see.
Near the end, Bob.
Right.
It's at the very end.
All right.
I get to run through the whole show. That's good.
No, let me go back here.
Three up.
Yeah, here it is.
There it goes, right there.
Okay.
There it is. Okay. Yeah. And I will, when we get the picture back.
So it's the first item, is it? There's the British Museum catalog.
Right.
Yes.
Duncan Garrow and Neil Wilkin.
That's it. Yeah.
It's a gorgeous book.
It's a fabulous book. It's also, it was given to me as a gift. I'm not sure I could have afforded it because it cost a fortune, but it's really, really good. And as I say, it's 272 pages.
Hold it up again, Bob.
Yeah, there you go. Can you see it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
How much was it approximately?
Just a minute till I see.
Of course, the pound is not so high anymore.
It was only 25 pounds.
Oh,
That's not bad.
that's nothing.
Probably
Yeah.
the same to ship it.
Yeah.
It's about 25 pounds.
Yeah, exactly.
Or
And
more.
5 pounds now is like shekels. It's nothing.
Stonehenge Decoded. I just looked it up on Amazon.
Yeah,
Gerald Hawkins. It wasn't
Yeah,
on the
Hawkins.
biography, but I
Yeah.
think it was really good.
yeah, yeah. That's the one that got me going on Stonehenge many years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, thank you, Bob. This is absolutely fascinating, especially
Okay.
the correlation between light and light in the cathedrals really was intriguing to me.